Stepfather looked at me, his presence overwhelming. A single touch, a fleeting glance, everything felt different now. Do you realize we've crossed the line? His lips were dangerously close to my neck. I could feel him squeezing my waist, his breath burning my skin. But I didn't say anything. I was 22 when my mother brought home a new man. It was her fourth marriage, and by then, I had learned not to care much about it. Still, there was something in the air that evening, a palpable tension I couldn't ignore. Richard, as he introduced himself without ceremony, was nothing like the men my mother had known before. At 60, he carried himself with an air of authority that was both intimidating and oddly magnetic. His stature was impressive, tall, well-built, with silver streaks in his hair that spoke of a life filled with experiences. Every movement he made was deliberate and confident. I noticed immediately that his presence altered the dynamics of our home, hinting at a danger that lurked just beneath the surface. Returning from a trip one evening, I walked into the living room and found him standing by the fireplace. He was casually scanning a shelf of books, yet his eyes shifted to me in an instant. "Oh, so this is her, the daughter of Elizabeth," he said, his tone measured but carrying a hint of appraisal. I met his gaze steadily and said, "Just Kate." There was a pause as he repeated my name softly, almost as if testing the sound of it, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying a hint of something unspoken. That same evening, after my mother had left for an errand, I found myself alone at the dinner table with Richard. The atmosphere had shifted from formal politeness to an unspoken challenge. As he poured wine into my glass, he asked, "How does it feel to be back?" I answered simply, "Everything has changed," aware that my words carried more weight in the charged silence between us. He ran his fingers along the rim of his glass before replying, "Now, this place belongs to me." In that instant, his leg brushed against mine under the table, a contact so brief yet loaded with intent. I didn't pull away. Instead, I held my ground, accepting the risk with a cool indifference that belied the storm of thoughts racing through my head. Later, as I made my way down the dim corridor, I sensed his presence behind me. Without waiting for a greeting, he said, his voice low and controlled, "Kate, be careful. Don't push me." His tone was less a warning and more a statement of fact, a reminder that his influence was inescapable. I felt the warmth of his body close, too close for comfort, and it struck me that this game was more than just flirtation. It was a test, and every move counted. I stopped in my tracks and turned to face him. "What if I want to push the limits?" I asked, my voice even but laced with a challenge. For a moment, the tension between us paused like the calm before a storm. Then he smiled, a brief, enigmatic smile that said he was ready for whatever came next. The encounter wasn't laden with excessive words or flowery descriptions. It was raw, immediate, and dangerous. Every gesture, every word was a deliberate move in a game where the stakes were high. The atmosphere crackled with an undercurrent of risk, a challenge that could not be ignored, a test of control and willpower. In that moment, I realized that life in this household was no longer about routine or predictable patterns. The air was charged with a sense of imminent change. Richard's every action seemed designed to push boundaries and force a reaction. I knew that what started as a mere introduction to a new family member was quickly evolving into something far more complex and perilous. As the night wore on, the tension did not dissipate. Instead, it grew with every passing second. I could sense that this was only the beginning, that the choices made in these moments would shape what was to come. I understood that in the coming days, every glance, every subtle touch would carry its own weight, a silent promise of further escalation. I left that corridor with a clear understanding. My world had shifted irreversibly. There was no turning back. The dangerous allure of Richard's presence had ignited a spark, and the game had only just begun. I stepped into the bathroom to grab a towel, not noticing that the door had been left slightly open. There, in the dim light, I saw Richard standing in front of the mirror, unbuttoning his shirt with a calm precision. His tanned, fit torso, marked by the quiet strength of age rather than youthful vigor, commanded my attention. I couldn't help but focus on the way his muscles moved as he worked the buttons aside. "Do you want a towel?" I asked, my eyes fixed briefly on his chest, watching every deliberate motion. He met my gaze in the mirror, his expression unreadable for a split second before he replied evenly, "Or do you want something else?" There was a spark in his eyes that wasn't there before, a flicker of daring challenge that made it clear this wasn't a simple question. Without a word, I tossed the towel toward him and left the bathroom, my mind racing with the implications of that encounter. The tension was palpable, each word and gesture a silent wager. I walked away with my heart pounding, not entirely sure if I was stepping into danger or if I was already too far in. The next day brought a new stage for this dangerous game. I was at the community pool, letting the cool water wash away the remnants of the previous night's charged moments. I was alone in the water for a while, enjoying the quiet solitude, when I suddenly noticed him at the doorway. "Kate?" Richard asked as he removed his watch, his voice calm and measured. I nodded without hesitation. The simple word yes passed between us, laden with unspoken meaning. He casually tossed aside his shirt and stepped into the pool, the water rippling around him as he moved with deliberate ease toward me. His approach was slow yet calculated, each stroke of his movement closing the gap between us. As he reached the edge, he leaned in close, so that there was barely a few centimeters separating us. In a low, conspiratorial whisper he asked, "Don't you think that all of this is too risky?" His tone was casual, yet the underlying intensity left no room for doubt about the stakes involved. "I love to take risks," I responded, letting my hand brush lightly against his. The contact was minimal, but it sent a clear message that I was as willing to challenge him as he was to test boundaries. The water around us shimmered under the late afternoon sun, and with each ripple, the charged atmosphere between us grew even more pronounced. Later that evening, we found ourselves on the terrace of a nearby guest house. I was exhausted from the day's events and leaned against Richard's shoulder without much thought. The simplicity of the gesture was loaded with meaning, a silent acceptance of the dangerous game we had embarked upon. "Kate," he murmured, his voice dangerously close to my ear. There was no need for elaborate declarations. His tone alone carried the weight of every unspoken promise and every unacknowledged risk. "I'm comfortable," I whispered back, keeping my head down as I tried to mask the tumult of thoughts swirling inside me. In that brief moment, as the twilight deepened around us, he reached out and placed his hand on my thigh. The move was both assertive and subtle, a reminder that every small act was part of this high-stakes interaction we had entered. "You have no idea how much you're testing me," he said in a hoarse tone that left little doubt about the intensity of his feelings. There was no dramatic flourish in his words, just the raw truth of the situation. Every action and every word was a calculated risk, a step further into a labyrinth of desire and danger. I considered his words and the implications behind them. The evening air was cool, and the quiet murmur of distant conversations blended with the soft clink of glasses from inside. The intimacy of the terrace was in stark contrast with the volatile energy that had been building since our first encounter. Every touch, every glance was a move in a game with no clear rules, yet with consequences that felt all too real. For a moment, I allowed myself to wonder if this dangerous game was something I truly wanted to pursue, despite the risks. The clear lines between right and wrong had blurred, replaced by an undeniable pull toward the unknown. My heart was steady, my mind alert. Each second felt charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. Richard's hand remained on my thigh as he continued to speak, his voice low and deliberate. The conversation between us was sparse, but each word was a loaded invitation, a dare that I could either accept or reject. I didn't offer a response right away. Instead, I let the silence hang, thick with expectation. As the night progressed and the terrace lights flickered like distant stars, I realized that this encounter was not just about physical attraction. It was a test of wills, a contest of boundaries where every gesture counted. I knew that stepping into this game meant accepting that every choice could lead to unforeseen consequences, and yet the thrill of the risk was undeniable. I looked up briefly, catching Richard's eyes as they searched mine for a sign, any sign of hesitation. There was none. In that unspoken moment, the dangerous game had reached another level. I woke in the middle of the night, the room cloaked in darkness except for the faint light seeping through the curtains. My heart pounded as I slowly became aware of a presence near my door. There he stood, a silent figure in the doorway. I froze, trying to understand how he had gotten there so quietly. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice low and edged with uncertainty. "Just looking," he replied calmly, his tone as steady as if he were making an ordinary observation. "Looking at what?" I pressed, struggling to maintain control of my racing thoughts. "Looking at you," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. In that instant, I could feel the unmistakable rise and fall of my chest, my body betraying the rush of adrenaline and something more primal. I was aware of every small movement, every unintentional reaction. "And what do you see?" I asked, my words barely a whisper in the stillness of the night. He paused, as if weighing his response carefully before replying, but which I am not allowed to have. His answer was enigmatic, charged with a tension that made the silence between us almost tangible. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in that brief exchange. A line had been crossed, one that neither of us could ignore. The moment left me questioning my own resolve and the rules that had governed our interactions until now. Later, as dawn gave way to a dull gray morning, I found myself moving about the house in a quiet haze. I entered the kitchen to fetch a glass of water, my mind still reeling from the encounter in my room. As I passed through the dimly lit corridor that connected the rooms, I suddenly felt the warmth of a hand brush against my stomach. I stopped in my tracks, and there he was again, moving with an air of deliberate calm. "What are you doing?" I asked, my tone firm even as my body remained rooted in place, unwilling to recoil from the contact. "You know," he replied, his voice soft but insistent, a single sentence that carried a weight of shared understanding. The simple words left little room for further explanation, yet they conveyed volumes about our tangled connection. I drew in a sharp breath, the silence around us intensifying the moment. "And what will happen next?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turbulence inside me. He leaned in closer, the space between us diminishing until I could feel the heat of his skin. "You will tell me yourself," he murmured, a challenge hidden in his tone. His words offered no reassurance, only an invitation to continue a dangerous game we had both been playing. I felt a mix of defiance and apprehension as I tried to decipher what the future might hold if I answered that unspoken question. That night did not end with quiet resolutions. A few days later, seeking a semblance of control or perhaps clarity, I entered his study. The room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, and the smell of aged wood and leather filled the space, a setting that somehow matched the intensity of our encounters. I leaned against the desk, allowing myself a moment of pause as I stared at the grain of the polished wood. "What do you want, Katia?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. His question was direct, devoid of the usual pretense we maintained in our public interactions. It was as if he was challenging me to define our relationship in concrete terms, rather than the blurred lines that had become our norm. I ran my fingers over the wooden surface, feeling the cool texture beneath my touch as I considered his words. "And you?" I countered, a subtle challenge that hinted I was just as curious about his intentions. He moved closer, the distance between us closing in a way that left no space for hesitation. His presence filled the small study, making every sound and every breath seem amplified. "Don't make me answer that question," he said, his tone low and resolute. There was a finality in his words, a refusal to explain further, leaving me suspended in a moment of raw uncertainty. Standing there, with the weight of his challenge pressing down on me, I realized that control had slipped from my grasp. The night's events, his unexpected visits, and the charged conversations had blurred the lines between desire and danger. I was caught in a game where every word and every touch had consequences, and I was no longer sure if I was willing to play by the rules that had once seemed so clear. By the time I left his study that night, a silent question lingered in the air: what would happen next? I stood in front of the fireplace, wrapped in a soft, heavy blanket as the flames danced in quiet rebellion against the darkness. The gentle warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the chill of uncertainty that had settled over me. Without a sound, he entered the room and moved behind me. Before I could register his presence fully, he pulled me into a tight embrace, his arms holding me with a firmness that brooked no refusal. "We're making a mistake," he murmured close to my ear, his voice steady yet filled with an undeniable tension. He didn't loosen his grip, even as his words hovered in the charged air between us. I didn't push away. Instead, I stepped closer, letting my body meet his in a silent challenge to the warning he'd just issued. "Then do one more," I said, my tone calm but laced with defiance. The challenge in my words was clear, a dare to cross another boundary in our precarious game. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft crackling of the burning logs, punctuating our unspoken understanding. In that moment, the pull between us seemed to blur the lines of caution and reason, drawing us deeper into a realm where every action could have irreversible consequences. Later that night, the setting changed dramatically as I found myself sitting in the front seat of his car. The interior was dimly lit, the hum of the engine providing a steady backdrop to our muted interaction. As he started the engine, his calm command cut through the silence. "Buckle up." I moved deliberately, fastening the seatbelt slowly, aware of every subtle shift in his gaze. I could tell he was watching me, his eyes lingering on my exposed legs with an intensity that was both unsettling and intoxicating. As the car pulled away, the world outside blurred into streaks of city lights and darkness. His focus remained fixed on me, and the tension between us grew with every passing moment. Suddenly, his tone shifted as he spoke, rougher now, a stark contrast to the earlier intimacy. His grip on the wheel tightened. "You're testing me, Kate," he murmured, his voice full of something I couldn't quite name. The unexpected harshness in his words sent a shiver down my spine, but I chose to respond with a measured, daring gesture. I ran my hand slowly along his thigh, a subtle provocation meant to test the limits of his restraint. "You wouldn't dare," I teased softly, a smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth as I met his unwavering gaze in the rearview mirror. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. The drive continued in a charged stillness, every word and gesture laden with the potential to tip the delicate balance between control and chaos. Not long after, during an evening when my mother was occupied in the next room, we found ourselves in a narrow corridor where the normal hum of the house seemed to fade away, leaving only our shared secrets. In that quiet moment, he pressed me against the cool surface of the wall, his presence both commanding and intimate. He whispered, quiet, as his hand gently grazed my ear, a touch so light yet deliberate that it left no room for misinterpretation. The proximity, the hushed tone, and the subtle brush of his hand all conspired to create a moment of intense intimacy and hidden danger. I allowed a small smile to form, a mix of playfulness and challenge dancing in my eyes. "Then don't make me noisy," I replied softly, the words carrying a defiant promise as much as they acknowledged the risk we were taking. My response was measured, a deliberate refusal to let the tension break into overt chaos, even as the danger of discovery loomed large. Each of these moments, from the tender yet conflicted embrace by the fire to the charged silence in the car and the secretive encounter in the corridor, carved deeper into the uncertain territory of our relationship. Every touch, every word, seemed to blur the boundaries we had once carefully maintained, pushing us further into an abyss where every action held the weight of irrevocable consequence. As the night wore on and the echoes of our clandestine interactions began to settle, I couldn't help but wonder where this dangerous path was leading us. The thrill of the unknown mingled with a palpable sense of foreboding, leaving me to question if the mistakes we were making now would define our future or simply mark the beginning of something neither of us could have predicted. In those quiet, charged moments, with the fire's glow as our only witness, I felt both the warmth of forbidden passion and the chill of imminent risk. The delicate dance between control and surrender had taken us to the very edge, and I knew that stepping back was no longer an option. The risk was too great, the stakes too high, and every heartbeat was a reminder that we were teetering on the brink of an abyss. Even as I pulled away from the wall in that secretive corridor, our eyes met one last time, a silent, potent acknowledgement of the dangers we embraced. And with that, the night left me suspended in a state of uneasy anticipation, a moment fraught with both desire and dread. "Then don't make me noisy." Candles flickered in the living room as my mother entertained her friends over an elegant dinner. The table was set with expensive wine and delicate dishes, exuding an air of sophistication. I sat directly across from Richard, dressed in a short, fitted dress with my hair flowing freely over my shoulders. The low murmur of conversation filled the room, yet my focus was entirely on him. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew charged with a secret intensity. At one point, when my mother turned away to join another conversation, I felt a subtle shift beneath the table. I realized with a jolt that Richard's leg had slid discreetly against my thigh. I barely managed to hold my breath, feeling an electrifying mix of apprehension and anticipation. I remained still, letting the unexpected touch speak volumes even in its silence. His voice, soft and deliberate, broke the hush that had settled between us. "You're playing a dangerous game," he whispered, ensuring that his words were meant for my ears alone. The quiet warning sent a thrill through me, a challenge that ignited something fierce inside. I met his intensity with a daring smile and replied, "And you've already lost," accentuating my words with a slow, deliberate lick of my lips. In that brief exchange, every unspoken word and hidden meaning layered upon our risky liaison. Later, after the dinner had ended and my mother had ushered the guests off to a nightclub, I found myself lingering by the entrance. Richard approached from behind, his presence as commanding as ever. "Are you going home?" he asked casually, his tone mingling curiosity with an unmistakable hint of intent. I glanced over my shoulder, questioning in my own way. "And you?" Without further explanation, he stated simply, "I have a room here." There was no time for me to probe into the details of his arrangement. Instead, I stepped into the elevator with him, drawn by the magnetic pull of our connection. The elevator doors slid shut, enclosing us in a tight, dim space. Almost immediately, Richard's proximity escalated the tension. He pressed me gently against the wall. I felt his lips graze my neck, leaving a trail of warmth that contrasted with the cool air of the car. "You're driving me insane," he murmured, his voice a mix of desire and barely contained frustration. His hands moved decisively, gripping my thighs with a force that spoke of his longing. Unable to contain a reflex, I let my head fall back slightly, surrendering to the rush of the moment even as I fought to keep my composure. Before we could let our impulses carry us further, the sound of voices in the corridor shattered our private bubble. The sudden, unmistakable call of Richard cut through the charged air like a knife. I froze, heart pounding in unison with what I imagined was our shared silence punctuated by the intrusion. I whispered quickly, "She can't find us here," my words barely audible, a feeble attempt to reassure both of us. Yet, in the depths of his eyes, I saw a mischievous glint. "Maybe we should give her a show," he suggested, his tone laced with daring defiance rather than regret. My breath caught as the door handle began to turn slowly, a sound that promised impending exposure. In that critical moment, time seemed to slow down. I felt the weight of every decision we had made up to this point and realized that there was no retreat from what was unfolding. Summoning every ounce of resolve, I stepped away from the secluded intimacy of the elevator. I approached the door and, without hesitation, flung it open. There, standing in the narrow corridor, was my mother. Her face was frozen in a horrified grimace, a silent testament to the betrayal of expectations. The shock in her eyes cut deeper than any reprimand could. At that very moment, I felt Richard's presence behind me as his hand slid onto my waist. In a tone that was both incredulous and mocking, he asked, "Do you need something, Mom?" His words hung in the air, thick with the irony of the situation. My mother said nothing, and a deathly silence settled among us, a silence that screamed of shattered pretenses and broken boundaries. Without a second thought, I squeezed Richard's fingers tightly, grounding myself in the reality of our perilous entanglement. I took a determined step forward, leaving the stifling room behind. "Let's go, my love," I commanded softly, my voice resolute as I moved away. I did not dare look back, knowing that the moment we returned our gaze, everything might change forever.